So just real quick. 1, 2, 3, boom.
Okay.
Ready? Yeah.
One. Okay.
One. You count.
2. Okay. 1, 2, 3. 1,
1,
2,
2, 3.
3.
Shit. Ready?
Yep.
1, 2, 3. Okay, so just 1, 2, 3, go.
All right.
Ready? 1,
1,
2,
2, 3.
3, go.
Just say it.
Kumquat.
Kumquat. All right. Well.
1, 2, 3, 4. If you can do all your stuff, what can figure it out? That's how it chooses you.
Hello, I'm Claire Patton.
And I'm Teresa Sparks.
And this is It Chooses You.
A podcast about enthusiasm.
We're here today. Teresa and I are recording remotely because we're still in quarantine. And I think we figured it out. So this should hopefully sound a little
We
improved.
sound like people.
We are people.
We are people, and one of us does not live inside a tin can.
Okay, so Teresa, you have told me you like geology.
I do.
I have sort of a shallow reason for not liking geology.
I think you told me.
Yeah.
I think you told me your reason, and I think you should share it with the class.
Okay. So, first, I will say that I recognize geology as an important thing. Geology is important.
It's a great start.
Thanks. It's important. It has an impact on our lives and where we live, and I'm sure it has other, all I remember is probably 4th grade. We studied earth science, right? And everything was brown. And so that's my problem with geology is, I like plants and green things and pretty flowers and colors, and that's great. And I don't generally consider myself a shallow person, but geology makes me feel shallow because I don't like that everything is brown. And I recognize that there are geodes and they're really beautiful and there's cool stuff. But in general, if I'm going to look at geology, I'm looking at brown stuff and it pisses me off.
That's fair. You don't have to like brown things. Like, you don't have to like them enough to... I mean, you should like some things that are lots of different colors, just to have balance in your beauty diet, But
Yes.
yeah, I know. I hear what you're saying, and especially for kids. I mean, do you want to look at this rock? Now look at this rock. Now look at this other rock, and they're all. It's 3 different kinds of rocks. Yeah, I get it.
So I will fully admit that there's a little bit more pressure on you because on some level, I'm depending on you to turn me into a not shallow person by convincing me geology is a valid, interesting science.
I didn't agree to be a part of that at all.
No pressure. I mean,
Okay, well, I can't defend geology from a color standpoint. So I think I'm gonna have to come up with a different tactic. And I hear what you're saying. It's not maybe the most visually engaging topic. I did not engage with it visually first. I like jargon. I like all different kinds of jargon. More broadly, I like language. I like words. I like that words mean things. Which sounds really dumb, but feels really deep, so I'm going to go with it. So I liked a lot of the words associated with geology. And not incidentally, my dad was a big fan of it. And if we want to talk about psychology, we can talk about why a relatively intelligent child growing up in an alcoholic farmhouse in West Virginia in the 50s may have enjoyed a reason to go outside and be gone for long periods of time. And so he really liked geology, and we live in an area in West Virginia where he was still finding arrowheads until the 70s and 80s.
Wow.
Part of it was he wanted to be out, and then he wanted to share his love of the things he discovered when he was out with his kids when he had them. And I was thinking about sort of how I got into it, because my dad likes a lot of things that I'm not into. But we're going to talk about 2 of the things that my dad likes that I'm really into in quick succession. We're talking about geology today, and we'll talk about baseball soon. And those are both directly from my dad. Those are direct parental inheritance. We didn't go out on hunting trips, rock hunting trips. What we did was anytime we were in the car together, like I said, I grew up in West Virginia, so they carved the roads through the hills. They used dynamite to peel off the face of the hill so that they could put a road in the flat place that resulted, right? And so anytime you're in a car in West Virginia, you can just look out the window and talk about geology, because you can see the layers, you can see the stratification. So a lot of it was that. I was also the navigator on family trips when we would see family. So we'd all be in the car and they would hand me a map. And it was partially because I would definitely pay attention to the map and not the people, and they needed me to be quiet probably for a while. But so the combination of looking at a map and like that visual representation of data that's super functional, because I was looking at information, and I put this all together later, obviously, when you're 7. I hope no 7-year-old is thinking like this, but visual representation of data that was functional. It's like, if I read this properly, if I interpret this data properly, I can get us to where we're going. So it's tied up with that somehow. Maps and being in the car and geology and all of that sort of tied together. And also there's something about, this is really general, but something about supporting the things I loved. And I loved looking out a car window watching landscape go by, right? Mm-hmm. And knowing the facts behind how those landscapes came to be, it was really cool to me. But I'm a nerd who really likes to have that fact that maybe not everybody has, and who drops it in just the right place. I'm into that, so.
It's wonderful to know what you're looking at and know why, and it is really lovely to have an encyclopedia of knowledge behind where you are and what's happening there.
Yeah. Well, and you said earlier that, geology, that geology impacts the way we live, and I would say it actually has determined a lot about how everything works. Mm-hmm. Because geology is basically the life cycle of planets, how rocks are formed and how they tend to erode and patterns related to that. There's a lot of controversy out there. And the world was not formed 4,000 years ago. It was spun into existence at the same time everything else was spun into existence about 4.6 billion years ago. And it was a piece of hot rock that cooled from the outside in. So it formed a crust first, and the center of the planet is still molten. And the movement of the plates that make up that crust determines a huge amount about not only landforms, but economies and all of the sort of much, much, much more recent human evolutionary pieces. So that's part of it too.
Well, and it's a really interesting point, and I'm just going to go ahead and bring this back to me, that you're raising, which is that I'm really fascinated by the idea that different living creatures have different timelines and tempos. Mm. So, a fruit fly that lives 24 hours, what does that feel like to them? And that creates an entirely different tempo than me as a human that will live forever.
That's right.
So I'm really fascinated at the comparison of those timelines. But what you're talking about is the tempo of eons.
Yeah, it's not a human scale of time.
Exactly. And maybe that's part of the reason why I have trouble relating to it. I consider myself, in general, to be a person with some amount of perspective. Mm-hmm. But that is a hell of a perspective, right?
Yeah. And I don't know if we can possibly, I don't think it's, maybe someone has. I can't imagine ever really viscerally understanding how long 1 billion years is, much less almost 5, right?
Right.
I did a little piece of research here. 1 billion seconds is 32 years. So that's what we're talking about. So 1 billion is not a number that we can actually make be meaningful. It's it's not impactful at all. It's not emotionally impactful, which is most of how we make meaning as people. So yeah, I get it. I mean, geology is the study of planetary events, and that happens on a very, very different scale than a human life. But that's actually part of why I like it so much, because it's sort of instant perspective. It does 2 things, right? It says, okay, look at how long the planet has been around. You have been here 42 years. Mm-hmm. You need to fucking chill. Your problems are not huge problems. They can't possibly be huge problems because you haven't existed long enough for them to be huge problems, right?
Right.
But that said, you're sort of comparing things that happen on a human scale to things that happen on a non-human scale, so it's not necessarily a fair comparison. But the other thing it does is it says, look at how long the world has been here. you've only been here 42 years, and look at the crazy things that have happened in your mind and in your life and in your relationships. Like, you're amazing. So it does two things. Like, it minimizes the harm and it aggrandizes the fun for me. Like, you know, so it's useful in that way.
There is a fantastic animated film from Germany called The Rocks. So I'm going to just go ahead and shout this out. It's on YouTube. It's by a German group, but it's called Rocks, Rocks. It's a short film by Chris Stenner, Heidi Wittlinger, and Arvid Jubel. I think that it wonderfully encapsulates the perspective that you're talking about. I don't really want to spoil it, but it's basically you watch the life cycle of one day in the life of rocks.
That's cool.
A group of animated rocks that have
That's
personalities.
Really cool. Yeah. That's awesome.
So check that out. It's going to bring up that exactly what you're talking about, and what I'm talking about with this perspective of tempo and different tempos. Yeah.
So the different scale thing is important to me when thinking about geology. It's not necessarily the sexiest on the surface. The things I like about it tend to be the more sexy things. Earthquakes are super cool. Earthquakes happen not because of geology, but we understand what happens during an earthquake through geology. An earthquake is just those plates I mentioned. Everyone has heard of the theory of plate tectonics, and it's mostly confirmed at this point. The plates are moving, so they're rubbing against each other in a lot of different kinds of ways, and when they rub against each other, sometimes they'll slip, and they'll move a really big distance, like half an inch at a time, and that'll cause an earthquake. There's also that line, I didn't even think of this, but I totally should have. There's that line from the Shawshank Redemption, where Red is like, geology is the study of pressure and time. And when you're in stir, you've got two things, pressure and time.
That's great.
Something like that, yeah.
Have you ever been in an earthquake?
Of course, but not a really big one. I took a show to the Vancouver Fringe Festival at one point, and I was sitting in our Airbnb in a high-rise and working on a laptop, and all of a sudden I looked up and I looked at my writing partner and I said, "Did you feel that?" And she said, "I think you might have had too much to drink last night. Nothing happened." And I was like, "We'll just fucking see about that." And I got on the news site and I was like, "Aha! There was an earthquake." So we were in an earthquake.
You know what's crazy about that is I've been in one earthquake and it was a very similar experience to what you just said. I was in Siena. I was doing a semester abroad, so I was with a lot of classmates, and we were in some cathedral. And myself and one or two other women were like, "Whoa." We could just feel it. And we looked around and we were talking to other classmates and nobody else felt it. And we were like, "No, there's something just happened." And I had never been in an earthquake before, so I didn't understand what was happening. We were fine. We were completely safe. But it was a devastating earthquake in, I want to say 97. I think it was the 97 earthquake in Tuscany. And it was actually quite serious, but where we were fortunately really safe. But similar thing with someone not believing me.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. You and I both have killer inner ears, man.
That's true.
Primo inner ears. There's also, like I said, the visual representation of data appeals to me. And I like maps of things. So there's an image that I feel certain was in a series of like kids' textbooks that were in my house growing up, where it's a whole landscape, and it's like, this is the glacier, this is the Piedmont, this is the river, this is the lake, and it's just like all sorts of landforms labeled for you. So you get to see how they relate to each other and what they're called in earth science and that sort of thing. And I just remember really, really loving that picture, and so wanting to know more from there. And then learning about a couple of different formations that have remained interesting because I see them all the time. One of them is, this is actually the thing that made us start talking about this as a possible episode, which is that I love things that are called hogbacks. And we're lucky enough in Colorado that we live just north of a really important one in geology. There's a place called Dinosaur Ridge in Morrison, Colorado, and Dinosaur Ridge is a hogback. And a hogback is basically a hill or a crest, a narrow crested hill that's created out of differential erosion. So it's two different kinds of rock, one of which erodes very quickly and one of which erodes more slowly. And the action of one part eroding sort of peels off the front and forms what's called the scarp slope, which is where all the debris is, and the slope that doesn't erode very much is called the dip slope. But I like their formation because they're really easy to get to up the dip slope. But then when you're on the other side, they're impossible because it's just a bunch of a loose rock that you'd have to scramble up, and you can't make it. And so I found it really interesting the first time I saw one, noticing, there's something where approaching it from one direction, it makes it impossible, and approaching it from the other direction, it's not even a hike, it's just a walk. And I found that really interesting too.
Well, that's fucking psychological.
Yeah.
Life lessons.
Life lessons, that's right. Just go around, man. Just go around and come at it from the other side, and it's real easy. Yeah.
And is it called a hogback because it looks like a hogback?
Yeah, I think the first one was in England. There's one that looks like a hog's back that's there, and that's when they said, hey, this is a thing. And then they went out and they're like, hey, there's another one of those things. They're called hogbacks,
Speaking of geological language, one of my favorite and most frustrating things when I'm reading, and I seem to recall this more from when I was a child and a teenager, but I remember reading a lot of descriptions of landscape and not knowing those words. So not being able to put a picture in my mind as people were moving through landscape. I mean, I read a lot of fantasy, right? So there were lots of epic journeys and a lot of description of landscape. And I loved the sound of that language, but I had difficulty following the mental picture. I wasn't able to create the mental picture in my mind, which I believe was a failing of my knowledge, obviously, not of the writing, because there were incredible passages, but I just couldn't generate a picture.
Yeah, I hear you. And not having an image to go with the word, that's a lot of what language acquisition is you point to the color red and you say red over and over again. And then when you hear the word red, it has a meaning, right? That's how we make meaning. And I don't know that this may be controversial. I don't know that science is taught at the elementary level in this country in such a way as to encourage people to engage with it. My sister, as I've said before, teaches high school science, and she teaches earth science. Our parents really cared that we learned things about the world, and it turns out a lot of parents don't care if their kids learn things about the world. So she has a lot of students come to her class who are not only, starting from scratch, but really just don't even have like a basic level of curiosity. And now I'm sort of going off into a tangent that's me bemoaning the state of education in the country, which I'm also not qualified to talk about, so I'm going to reel that back in.
We keep judgy Teresa on a short leash around here.
Yeah, she's not very fun.
Not really. She's totally fun. I love her. I would say she's in my top 5 of favorite Teresas.
Aw, she made the top 5? We're standing on a big ball of lava. And there's really not, compared to how big the ball of lava is, there's not that much separating us from it, really. Yeah. It's quite something. The great thing about being here is that we're actually in a geologically interesting area in a lot of ways. When you drive along the Diagonal Highway, there's what we call Haystack Mountain. And for those of you lucky enough to have experienced Haystack Mountain goat cheese, that's where that comes from, is a mountain in our county called Haystack Mountain. And it's basically a hill left over when the glacier retreated. So it's a little hill, green hill, that's maybe half as tall as the Front Range, and it's just set a little way out. And so you see that and you think, how can that possibly, why is that there? I think that's what it is. Why is that there? How did that come to be there? There's a great meme that I found that encapsulates like my feeling about geology, and how that I hope makes people who don't necessarily vibe with it the way I do understand at least why I'm involved, which is so that the cheating boyfriend meme, where he's walking with one girl but looking at another. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's from a Charlie Chaplin film. The original is Charlie Chaplin walking with his wife and looking at a girl. In that meme, Charlie Chaplin is the geoscientist. His wife is the immediacy of now. And the girl walking by is the monstrous depth of geologic time. I was very happy that geologists turn out to be funny. The thing you said about not knowing what the words mean and you can't picture it, so it's not as relevant to you. There's actually a woman who does a geology word blog. Her name is Evelyn Mervine, and this is from 2011, so I don't know if she's still doing it, but it's Geological Musings, Wanderings, and Adventures. And she actually has a word of the week, and she sent a call out to a bunch of other geologists, I'm assuming, about what their favorite words are, and it's like autobrecciation, boundinage, myelinite, crozzel, subduction. But they're all like, listen to this crazy ass word. I'm actually going to tell you what crozzel means right now. That's Crozzle, because nothing in humanities is called a crozzel. And apparently, the person who said it's their favorite doesn't actually want to define it. Because I went to their blog, and they're not interested in telling us what it is. So, a crozzel is a brick deformed by excessive heating during its manufacture. I think we call this the rock cycle. That's sort of the largest piece of actual science and information that I was trying to communicate today. Because when you look at something and you want to know how it came to be, if you're talking about landforms, you're talking about the rock cycle. The rock cycle has to do with weathering and erosion. Magma crystallizes into rocks. Faults thrust them up into mountain ranges or subduct them under the ground. The rocks are weathered by UV radiation, uplift, exposure to the elements. They're moved around by rivers and streams. Sediments are compacted into rocks. The sedimentary rocks, when they're put under pressure, turn into metamorphic rocks that then melt and turn back into magma. So there are three different kinds of rocks: igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic, and that's sort of the order they go in. So, igneous rocks are the youngest. They've been most recently formed. Sedimentary rocks are middle-aged, and metamorphic rocks are oldest, usually. In terms of rock cycle, not in terms of geologic time, again. But I just love knowing those things, because if you want to know how humans impact the world, it takes so long, and we have to be so involved with a system to impact it on anything like a scale that's going to be relevant to geology and to the cycle of the planet. And yet we're managing to do it.
Right.
So, we haven't, I don't think, made any geologic changes, but the changes we're making in weather patterns are definitely going to impact that cycle, which I find challenging and fascinating. Do you like geology any better now than you did before I started talking?
I do.
I know you like me better, because that's your general trend, is to like me better after I'm done talking.
For fucking sure. No, this is the thing I love about you, is that you're interested in smart shit.
Cool.
You're not burdened by the desire to be popular and well-liked. You just follow whatever it is your fancy dictates.
No, I'm definitely burdened by the desire to be popular and liked. I just care about being popular among a different group.
Yeah. Geologists.
They have much higher standards. And they don't like me.
No, it's just, this reminds me why I love you. It reminds me why you're an endlessly fascinating person, because you find the world endlessly fascinating. Well, thank you for telling me all that.
Well, I'm very excited. I hear that you have something to tell me about today as well.
I do. I'm going to talk about baking, and more specifically, baking bread. Because guess what, Teresa? Gluten is back. All it took was one pandemic, and gluten is fucking back, baby. It's happening. Okay. It's happening. Everybody's baking bread. And if you're not, you're out of it. Everyone is baking. So I like to consider myself marginally tapped into the food zeitgeist of America.
Yeah, I was like, she's definitely speaking from a wise place when it comes to what everyone is doing in their kitchen right now. It's pretty amazing.
Okay, look.
You got a line on it.
The shit went down.
It did.
And a huge portion of our population's response was to start baking bread.
Correct.
So people are baking sourdough loaves. People are baking different kinds of bread. It is important. So this is like, I don't know, for me it's really interesting. Like, when the shit goes down, what are you doing?
Yeah.
We're baking bread. It's auspicious that we're discussing it today, because although I have worked in the medium of sourdough in the past, it's been about a year and a half, and I just baked my first successful loaf of sourdough this morning.
Yay!
Yeah. So I had...
Not your first successful ever.
No, but this phase...
you gifted me You gifted me a loaf of sourdough
Yeah.
with a lot of seeds pressed into it.
Yeah, no, this is phase 2 of my sourdough learning. So yeah, I was
You cut me off before I could compliment you,
Oh,
which
sorry.
is totally how you operate. You heard it coming. You're like, she's going to say something nice. I should
I'm
definitely
like, yeah,
keep
it was
talking.
good. I got an agenda here.
Yeah,
No, just kidding.
yeah. It was one of the most delicious loaves of bread I've ever had, and you made it with your hands.
Well, thank you.
It was really, really good.
Thank you.
Good job pretending not to hate every second of that.
I'm such a good actress. So yes, again, a year and a half ago, I had been baking some sourdough bread, and for various reasons, I dropped off doing that. In my head, it was like I had just been baking sourdough last year, and then when I actually sat down and thought about it, I'm like, it's been like a year and a half. It's been a while. I started my sourdough starter about, I want to say, a month and a half ago, and this is one of the things I love about baking bread and baking with sourdough specifically, is that there was a combination of the maturity of the starter as well as the weather here that finally ignited everything a couple days ago. And so I had actually, this week, I've baked 3 disaster loaves leading up to this beautiful one that I'm very proud of, that I think is actually the best loaf I've ever baked. So I'm really excited that we're talking about this today.
Me too. Can you tell me what distinguishes disaster loaves from perfection?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the texture. The main thing for me is the rise. I'm a little bit of a rise snob because...
Oh, it was right there. It was so close. You're a rise queen.
Yes. This is true. I get really judgy about the rise of my loaves. So... that's the main thing I'm talking about. When I say, for me, disaster is a loaf that hasn't risen.
Okay.
It's a wasted potential.
Sure. That yeast died for nothing.
Exactly. And it is life, you know. Basically, my starter just wasn't ready, is what happened, which is typical of me, very pattern. I'm always early. My natural rhythm and tempo is to be a little bit early, but it's early by like a day. I was pushing. I could feel myself pushing too, right? It was like, it's got to go in the proving drawer. It's got to, because it's too cold in the house and all this stuff. And I was totally pushing. I baked 3 that were not only short, and they were, I want to say about maybe 3 inches tall, but then like sunken and distorted in the middle. They were krezzels. What was
Krozzles.
Krozzles.
Krozzles. That's right.
They were bread
You're baking
krozzles.
That's right. Bread krozzle. Uh-huh.
So, it's fucking so geological now.
You are. You know the lingo as well as that guy does who refused to define it.
Exactly. What a dick.
He's like, everyone knows what this is. I don't need to say.
Everyone knows what a krozzle is.
So you made 3 krozzles because you pushed it.
Did.
Now, I know only this much, which is a short inch
Yeah.
about baking. But I know from Paul Hollywood that it's possible to overprove, and that the sinking in the middle can happen when you overprove, because it spends all of its energy too early and then it goes.
Yes, totally.
Is what
And in fact, that is a distinct possibility with these, because they weren't rising. I had to prove them for a really long time. So it was a weird combination of under and overproofed, probably. But it's because the starter culture wasn't mature enough to actually expand and create anything and hold anything.
So when you make loaves like that, I don't want to derail you.
Yeah, no.
So please tell me to be quiet. When you make loaves like that, do you eat them and just have just a series of regret toast breakfasts?
No, I composted them.
Oh, okay.
I felt a little... I wasn't able to sit with that failure. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's interesting because
do chickens eat bread?
They can. I think they're not supposed to have a lot of it. I've actually cooked them quite a few sourdough pancakes and stuff with my extra starter. The thing I want to say about, I didn't plan to jump right into sourdough, but I did.
Sorry.
No, I did because I baked a loaf, so it's on my mind. But the thing about sourdough is, and with all yeast, you're dealing with a living creature or creatures. And the thing about sourdough is that it's a wild living creature, right? So it's not a cultivated, farmed, bred yeast. It's the natural yeast in the air, which you capture, you mix with flour and water and salt, and out of it comes bread. And it is the closest thing to magic that I've ever been capable of. And that's why I love baking bread so much. But they're like little fairies, right? Little bread fairies. And sometimes they don't do what you want them to do. It's a process that teaches you a lot about patience. The thing about sourdough that's really challenging, if you're not a naturally patient person, it can be really difficult. But it's a good lesson in patience. So if you're interested in learning that, it helps. However, the issue with sourdough is that there's such a long period of time in which you're not getting anything out of it. And that's challenging. There's so much of a steep learning curve. And like I said, I've been feeding my starter once a day. I've now switched to twice a day, but once a day for a month and a half and getting nothing. So it's hard. That's hard.
So you feed it by giving it what?
You feed it by giving it flour and water. The flour is its food.
Okay. So the flour is its food, and the yeast is what's eating it.
Yes, and the yeast, you're basically capturing it from the air. But there are other methods where you can use organic fruit and things like that to speed that process up. Mm-hmm. But I've never been successful with that.
So you're feeding it twice a day for a month, or once a day for a month. Mm-hmm. And in that time, you have enough of it to try and make a loaf? Or are you making it big enough to turn into a loaf?
Yeah, so it's a little complicated. So the starter is a very abundant thing. You don't need a ton of it. You've always got extra and you're throwing it away. So when you feed it, you take a little bit of it and save it and feed that. And that basically creates a new colony. And you just continue doing that daily by feeding it flour. So you can take the extra and make bread, or you could bulk it up. You know, if you were going to bake a lot of loaves, you could bulk up more starter. But what you do is you when you're ready to bake, a day before you're ready to bake, this is the thing about sourdough, is you take a little bit of that starter and you create what's called a levain. You take a little starter, you feed it more flour and water as a separate thing, and that is basically your yeast culture for your bread.
The yeast culture that you make is then you add more flour to it, or is the yeast culture the levain that you make, is that the loaf just in a different state of being?
No, it's the yeast culture that goes into the bread. So then you've got all your flour for your bread. So basically, I have my starter.
Yeah.
I take a little, if I want to bake bread, I have to feed that starter, so I'm constantly throwing most of it out and keeping just a little and feeding it and throwing most of it out. When I want to bake bread, I take a little bit of that starter, which should be at its peak rise. So this is the other thing, is it's time as well. So you want it when it's really active. And you can control that by how often you feed it. That's why I do twice a day now, results in a bread that rises faster, because I'm selecting for the yeast that reproduces quicker. So I'm doing my own little natural selection of yeast.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So
we're going to label your pea plants with little yellow flags.
Yeah. So I take a little bit of my starter apart from that, because I'm going to bake a loaf.
Yeah.
I feed that little bit of starter flour and water, and that's going to become my levain. It's in all practicality, it's another starter. I let that rise for somewhere between, depending on the temperature, 6 to 8 hours, something like that. And then I mix that, I'm simplifying here, but I mix that with the flour and water for the loaf.
Okay.
And then the yeast.
Are you simplifying it because really what you have to do is like soak it in water and separate it out until
No. I'm just saying,
Okay.
I'm simplifying because there's a process called autolyse where you let just the flour and water hang out together to hydrate, because that builds gluten. So I'm simplifying because I don't just add it directly to the flour and water. Though I did on this last loaf because I fucking forgot, and it turned out great. So who knows? So basically there's the starter. You take a piece of the starter, which becomes the levain, and then basically that levain is you feeding the yeast in a new colony. That's what you add to your flour and water for your actual loaf or loaves. Mm-hmm. And then basically that culture of yeast is really strong when you add it to the flour and water for your actual loaf. It starts eating the flour and basically farting out CO2, and that's what gives your bread a nice rise. Okay. So you're just building a strong colony to go into the final loaf, basically.
Okay. The thing I'm really taking from your description of how this works is that it's no wonder that homemade bread is expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just crazy. Like, oh, maybe 6 or 8 hours, but it depends on the phase of the moon and how humid it is and my mood, and also if the window's in the south or not. Okay.
No, completely. And temperature is a huge factor. And that's what was giving me basically trouble at the beginning of this week was temperature. So for every 15-degree increase in temperature in its environment, the rising time will be twice as fast.
Oh, okay.
The really neat thing about sourdough is you can't really miss it. You won't miss the like if you miss the window, it's because you ignored it for 3 or 4 hours, you know? So it's not a quick thing. That then it's hard to miss that window of when it's good to go. What's difficult is knowing what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest thing about sourdough specifically. And regular yeast as well, any other kind of baking with yeast. And it's one of those things like when you see it, you go, yeah, okay. This is what I thought baking bread was going to be like. But until then, you're like, I don't know. Is it overproofed? Is it underproofed? I'm not sure. It's supposed to double in size, but it hasn't. You know, all this stuff. But when you see it, it's like, oh, man, that's it. Yes, of course that's it. I know that's it. So it becomes a lot easier. But until then, you're just stabbing in the dark, basically. I mean, that's how it feels. It's a really frustrating process, but it's also really rewarding. One thing I was thinking about last night as I shaped my loaf to bake this morning was when it's right, I don't care what kind of bread you're baking, whether it's sourdough, whether it's brioche, whether it's like, you know, a boule or something like that. When that dough is right, it is fucking sexy as hell. When you touch it, it is so sensual. It is soft. It is creamy. The sound it makes is incredible. And so it's like a cloud hug, love. I don't know. It is so goddamn sexy. And then you're like, oh, right. No wonder bread is so fucking delicious. So yeah, the loaf this morning had a beautiful crackly crust. It had a lovely ear on it, which is the part where you slash it on the top and it opens up. A little geological for you. It's like the hogback of bread. No. I wanted to please you so much with that. You slash it to allow the steam to escape so that it doesn't pop out the sides or something. And
you determine where it
exactly.
exits.
And it opens up, and then you get this crag where it opens up, which is the crispiest. It's the prized part. It's called the ear. The ear was lovely. The crust was fantastic, and the inside was just airy and fluffy, and impossible that you did this with literally flour, water, and salt. Yeah. It is magic. And there's something that I get why people are doing it right now. Like in the crazy world we're living in the uncertain times, that's what all the ads say. Look, in these uncertain times, like what you're looking for is reassurance that you can take care of yourself, and nothing encapsulates that like bread.
Yeah, I'm actually having a biological response to you even saying that. I'm like, yeah, that's right. I have access to enough calories.
Yeah.
The organism is pleased.
The organism approves. I wanted to talk a little bit. The first bread I ever baked is a quick bread from my friend Becca from college, and it was called Becca's Beer Bread. I still have the recipe, the original from, last week when I was in college.
Yeah.
And it was just, I think it mainly rose with baking soda or powder and beer, and it wasn't anything you had to let rise. You just popped it in the oven. So that was, and it's delicious. It's still good. I still make it on occasion, and it's really easy. So that's a great place to start, is with a quick bread. Or I love making biscuits, which also don't require yeast. But I do want to talk about brioche. For anyone who might not know, brioche, probably most people know, but brioche is a bread of French origin, which can be a loaf for many different shapes. It's a little similar to challah, if you've ever had that. But it's basically a bread dough that's enriched with definitely eggs, definitely butter, and occasionally milk. And the first time I ever had it, I was in Italy, but someone had brought it home to our apartment from Switzerland. It was a roommate. And it was a mass-produced loaf, like you would get at the grocery store, of brioche. And I tried it, and I was like, my mind was blown. This flavor, what is this flavor? I was born to eat this. I mean, really.
I love that.
It was incredible. It has this sweet, tangy flavor to it that is, I've never had in anything else. It's so good. It's incredible. Anyway, I started making my own brioche a few years ago, and I certainly don't make it all the time. And it's just wonderful. It's a really great toast, a bread for toast. It's really great for French toast. It's a really light, fluffy, delicious bread that I usually make as a loaf for sandwiches or something. And I just adore it. I just think it's so good. As a sort of play off on that, I make a brioche dough pecan roll that's out of this world. And it's a recipe from Nancy Silverton, who's quite well known from La Brea Bakery. She's amazing. She baked it with Julia Child, so that the recipe got famous on Baking with Julia. So it's in the Baking with Julia cookbook. For a really long time, I called it Julia Child's brioche pecan rolls, and I actually had to correct them. Like, that's really not fair. It's Nancy Silverton's. So it's made with a brioche dough, and I'm generally not a pecan roll huge fan of those, but these are incredible. I mean, I think it's a total of 3 or 4 sticks of butter in like one pan of I mean, it's just certainly not
delicious.
An everyday treat.
Delicious.
Oh my God,
yeah.
So delicious. They're just.
Did you say she was from the La Brea Bakery?
Yeah, she started La Brea, I think.
You know, the La Brea tar pits are a geological phenomenon.
Another connection.
There it is.
Yeah.
Okay. I just needed to say that.
She's a wonderful baker and teacher. She's great. Anyway, these pecan rolls, man, you guys look up Nancy Silverton's brioche pecan rolls. If you're an experienced baker, it's time consuming. You know, that's important that you're giving something your time and attention, that we should all pay zillions of dollars for that because it's so good.
Well, I mean, it sounds like it definitely requires love and attention. And you mentioned that the yeast fairies kind of decide what they're going to do and the environment that they want. So also, it seems like it's a little bit of an act of faith, too. Like, I'm going to keep feeding this, and one day it'll turn into bread.
Definitely.
Yeah.
You know, growing up in the 80s, it seemed like culturally there was this phenomenon of really just leaving everything to the experts. But that's definitely changing now. People are much more into DIY dentistry and DIY movement's huge. And I think YouTube's a big reason why. You know, just that we're the ability to communicate the secrets of the universe to each other, which is really cool. Yeah, so bread baking was something that experts did, not normal people. You know, you go to the store to buy your bread. So as someone who grew up in that environment, it's just amazing to me that we can do this. Magic.
Yeah. I had a friend of mine in high school, her mother was a big old hippie, and they made recipes out of the Tassajara bread book.
Oh, yeah.
All the time, and actually gifted me my first copy of it, I think, which I still have. And after trying, so I was like, well, I don't know if I have the temperament for this.
Yeah.
Like, you know, it's like, okay, and now wait another day, and now wait another 8 hours. I'm like, okay, so I'm willing to pay the magicians who can make it. It's not a spell I feel the need to master.
That's great.
And your bread is delicious.
Thank you. It is.
Yeah.
It is delicious. I think the theme today is that time is magic. Time.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yes, I was just agreeing with you.
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
I was just trying to think if I wanted to phrase that in a cooler way.
Yeah, I mean, human intention is powerful. So you made the perfect loaf. Have you tasted it?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, you want to show it to me?
Oh,
So
yeah.
I can maybe.
Sure,
Yeah,
let me
yeah.
go get it.
Yeah, go grab it.
Hang on.
So while Claire is doing that, I'm going to tell you all of her secrets. But she doesn't really have any, so it's going to be kind of boring. But I think maybe she'll like hearing it. I don't know if she can hear me, actually. Claire, I don't think you can hear me, because I think you took your headphones out. So everybody listen. Claire is an amazing human being, but she really does have problems accepting compliments. So if you do ever write us at itchoosesyou@gmail.com, be really nice to Claire because she 100% deserves it. And she won't be nice to herself. Okay, here she's back. Oh, she's so pretty!
I mean, that looks like some motherfucking professional baked it.
It really does. It has the... Yes, so I see the ear, and I see where you slashed it on the top.
Do you see the speckles?
I see the
bubbles?
speckles, and I see striations there.
That's from, in geological parlance, that's from the breadbasket.
Oh, cool. So that's an external phenomenon. That's not a part of the... Oh, she's so beautiful inside. Look at that. So, again, Paul Hollywood has taught me everything I know. And there's no density at the bottom of this loaf. It's uniformly open and beautiful the whole way. I can't hear it crispy, but I bet it is crispy.
Oh, wait.
And I bet... Yeah! That's not a shoebox, folks. That's a loaf of bread.
And then it
beautiful.
got a little overdone on the bottom, but you don't even notice. So.
Mary Berry would say, it's caught. It's caught on the bottom.
Yeah, it's so fun.
I'm super impressed that you make it. I love that you love it.
What was I going to say? I think it was something about another... Oh, just bake something. Like, it doesn't have to be bread if bread isn't your thing. You know, you made cookies a couple weeks ago.
I did. I also made a pineapple cake.
I always think about that scene. Have you ever seen that movie Stranger Than Fiction?
Of course.
So it's Will Ferrell, and he's a IRS auditor, and he goes to audit this sort of punk renegade cool baker woman. I remember this moment where she offers him a chocolate chip cookie.
Yeah. Is it a cookie or a cupcake?
I think it's a chocolate chip cookie because
Okay.
he says he's never had a homemade one or something, and she says, "What do you mean you've never had a homemade chocolate chip cookie?" And like, I just never. She's like, "Your mother never baked you one?" He's like, "No," and she just saw it as the evidence of a life not fully lived, through no fault of his own, of course, but like, it just said so much about that character. That's really stuck with me.
She also, I think, said in that scene, she's like, "You had a horrible day. I made sure of it. So have the cookie." It's what you do when you've had a horrible day.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something, the carbs, the baking, that's security. That's, it's an act of love for the people around you and for yourself. And people are turning to it in a time of crisis, for sure.
I definitely want you to teach me how to bake. And I think we'll do a video episode at some point where we'll make
I would love
some
that.
kind of you'll teach me how to make some kind of bread.
Yeah.
I think that sounds super fun.
I mean, email me your bread questions, guys. So this is the other thing I wanted to say. I'm really feeling strongly right now that I want to share this with people. So I'm so glad to have this opportunity, but I want to teach people on video, phone, whatever. I don't care. I just want to talk about it.
That's super cool. So if you have any questions about baking, our email address is itchoosesyouPodcast@gmail.com.
Please send it.
Where you can say nice things about Claire, and she'll pretend you haven't. And you can also ask her questions about bread, which she will notice and answer. Well, that's amazing. I like food, but again, like temperament, it's temperament. Baking is like you have to bring your A game. Cooking is like, what do I have in the fridge? Can I make it tasty? And the answer is always yes if you have fat.
Yeah.
So it's very straightforward, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, baking is serious. Baking is engaging with another living thing and requesting that it do something for you.
Yeah, and I will say, just in full transparency with my baking, I don't make it up with baking. I do follow recipes. It's...
Sure.
I don't...
I would be amazed if any of you make up baking recipes and just like wing it. Write in, because you're a genius and we need to know you.
Well, thank you so much, Teresa.
Thank you. It was great talking with you about bread.
And geology. Okay.
Okay,
Love
bye.
you. Bye.
Love you.
Bye.
Testing. Great. Thank you for listening to It Chooses You. Your hosts are Teresa Sparks and Claire Patton. Our theme song is by Bobby Dart. If you'd like to get in touch with us, drop us an email at itchoosesyouPodcast@gmail.com.
Everything I say is interesting. How dare you?